Okay, so let's start. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the second webinar in a series titled The New Media Between Science and Fiction. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Anna Kertyczak and I'm a project coordinator at Fulbright Poland. And it is my pleasure to welcome our wonderful speakers and the moderator of today's meeting. Professor Dariusz Jemielniak, professor at Koźmiński University and the chair of Minds department there, and faculty associate at Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, Harvard University, is our moderator, and he is also a Fulbright alumnus. So I'm very happy to have you here. Dariusz will lead a discussion with two of our guests, Dr. Anna Czarnecka, Deputy Director for Science at the Maria Skłodowska-Curie National Research Institute of Oncology, and also a Fulbrighter, and Doug Specht from University of Westminster, the Director of Teaching and Learning in the School of Media and Communication there. It's an honor to have you here today. Thank you both for joining us and for accepting our invitation. And I hope all of you, ladies and gentlemen, will enjoy today's discussion. And if you do, please follow our website for upcoming webinars and our social media channels, where we invite you to all of our other events. Also, please be reminded that this event is recorded and we will publish it later on our YouTube channel for the benefit of those who couldn't be with us today. And to you, Dariusz.
First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I think it is a great honor, a great opportunity. I'm really delighted to have such wonderful guests. And Doug, all I can say, you need to apply. You know, Fulbright is a wonderful thing, so you should try. To the point, I think the topic we're having here is super important. However, with your backgrounds, Doug and Anna, so diverse, I'm wondering if you could tell us a few words on what you think the misinformation, what are the fields in which the misinformation and fake news and the general disinformation theme is most dangerous. And I'm wondering if we can start a discussion around what fields are so dominated and what fields are so dangerous in terms of misinformation effect. And I would like to invite Anna, maybe you can go first because your name starts with A.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. It's a great to meet you, although probably in-person meeting would be even more interesting. However, due to pandemic, I'm happy we can meet online. So going into this misinformation, I think it's very, very dangerous in the field I represent. So in medicine in general and in treatment, in particular cancer treatment, it's actually something that I have problems with like every day in practice. Fake news in terms of fake therapeutic, choices is so popular. It's everywhere, like YouTube, Facebook, web pages. Actually, every day I meet some people who are asking me about, frankly speaking, fake therapies. And this is very dangerous because some of the people would ask me what to do, but I'm sure there is a group, and it's not a small group of people who make decisions that may be life-threatening based on this fake information. If it's sore throat treatment, then well, okay, there might be coughing 1 week more, but if it goes to cancer treatment and taking some alternative medications or specific biofeedback or holistic or whatever approaches, it's absolutely dangerous. And sometimes it's life-threatening.
Got it. Doug, what do you say? Can you beat this medical claim to being the most dangerous of all?
I mean, I think what's really concerning about these things, there was a poll that was conducted a couple of weeks ago by the the Cambridge Globalism Project, who found that between a quarter and a third of people in the UK and the United States are susceptible to being or are already sort of drawn into numerous types of conspiracy theories, not all about health. But this is particularly acute at the moment when we're talking about things like vaccines for COVID, when we're talking about belief in COVID, whether COVID is created by 5G, these kinds of conspiracy theories. But we're talking about a third of the population of the United States and the UK, and that's the countries I have the figures for to hand, that are susceptible to this. So the danger around this is just how much of the population can so easily be drawn towards these things. And I think what becomes really crucial is to really start thinking, and I hope that's what we're going to try and get to a little bit today, is about how do we then untangle that? Because presenting arguments doesn't always actually work. And I think when we start thinking about fake news, we need to pull back a few more layers to understand why such huge numbers of people can be so easily drawn in the midst of a global pandemic where we know that tens of thousands, millions of people are getting infected, many dying. We don't dispute that in any way, but still people are being pulled into things where they feel like they can dispute that, where they are questioning those things. And even in the face of so much evidence that there's a danger out there, we're seeing that people aren't able to believe, and indeed want to encourage other people not to believe. And that's hugely dangerous, and that's where we need to start scraping back and finding out what's happening.
I think it's an excellent point. And the reason why I was trying to find what kind of misinformation is most dangerous is that of course, it's difficult to say what is more dangerous, the plague or the cancer. But the big picture is, of course, that we do have the medical misinformation, which is affecting the very lives of people. But we have the political misinformation, which is affecting the institutions, democratic institutions of power, which affect everything, basically. Wars happen, people die because of wars too. And third, we also have misinformation, which is related to social issues, as well as basically our understanding of how the world works. And I'm thinking especially about the climate change denialism. I'm thinking about the campaigns against migration. And these are also extremely dangerous and are having a very direct effect on our lives. And of course, I know we're not going to create a ranking of what is worse or what is well better. But I think that what I found really most shocking is what Judak said and what Joanna said as well. People are using misinformation in a very vital topics. Like if I can possibly imagine what is happening in the head of a person who is suffering for such a horrible disease like cancer and is visiting Anna, a qualified, highly accomplished doctor, and is still spouting nonsense and trying to subvert the expertise. So my question to you would be, to what extent you think this misinformation is more a communication issue? We know the social media, the spreading misinformation as a result of a business model, or to what extent it's correlated with challenging the existing knowledge institutions, sort of a deeper crisis of intellectualism, of belief in academia, or the existing, knowledge hierarchies, the professoriate of sorts. What do you think?
I'm afraid it's not the problem with misunderstanding of what is written by social media. I'm kind of afraid there are more and more movements that do not believe in science, and with medical field, that's like questioning some basic medical facts or clinical trials results or general knowledge about human body pathogens and stuff like that. So there are people like with the famous vaccines that are supposed to cause autism, which is multiple times shown as a fake news and not true. But there are more and more groups of people who believe that the scientists are sponsored by big pharma. Or
I think, Doug, what you said was really interesting in a sense that you might spout misinformation even though you totally believe it's not true, because you sort of manifest your belonging to a group, you manifest your identity. And I think this is very to the point. It's about the narratives which don't have to be factually true, but they are true in a sense of storytelling. Yeah, maybe Hillary Clinton did not actually drink children's blood, but it's very much like her. So, and this sort of Trumpian thinking, I think, got there, and I think it's very distinctive from cancer treatment misinformation, because you share those cancer misinforming materials, mostly, as you said, to show there are easy fixes, but also to subvert, to claim that the existing institutional knowledge regime is actually trying to oppress you, trying to rip you off, fleece you. You know, it's at a big pharma trying to get you. And by the way, the fact that some medical studies are sponsored, and it's of course oftentimes declared in the publication, is also tapping into those sentiments. Very often misinformation will base on a vestige of truth and then distort it and twist it and come to the conclusion that everyone is bought out. Ironically, by the way, because Wakefield, I think, took 50,000 just for producing the study itself that you referred to, Anna. Isn't that right? What do you think?
Well, going into this sponsorships, I would like to just clarify that most of the trials, both with vaccines like COVID vaccines or any other medications, are sponsored by some companies for straight, financial reasons. Public universities, let's say, or research institutes are not able to cover such a cost. So it's absolutely not a secret or nothing wrong with a company that is investing the money. You know, out of the 100 pro drugs in oncology, they would get just few, like 3 or 4 into the market. So it's an enormous investment to get any refund from that. So this is not possible for other institutions to have such an enormous amount of money to get the trials and get the drugs or vaccines or other medical equipment into the market. So I think most people just don't understand the cost of producing novel molecules or novel compounds that become drugs. And they put some secret behind it. It's just pure economy.
Well, to be perfectly honest, this model works in different businesses too. If you want to bring something to the market, oftentimes you will use external expertise, external tests of proper experts, and you will have to pay for the tests being done, because for obvious reasons, why should anybody care? Doug, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the question of funding is always very interesting, and you know, I fully agree with Anna in terms of medical funding. I think if we're going to talk about funding and fake news, I think that there's interesting amounts of funding from people like Google, who are interested in funding research about fake news and who fund large university projects. University of Oxford, for example, has a large amount of money coming from Google to investigate essentially what Google do. Now that feels like a much more compromised position. And so if we're going to start talking about the relationship between external funders and fake news, it's not the medical world that has anything to answer to here. It's actually those platforms that are making their money out of sharing the fake news. And those reasons, as I said, for sharing it are more complex than just financial, but the mechanism that allows it to be done so easily is financially driven. And so, you know, those same companies putting in money to check whether they're dealing with fake news right doesn't sound quite okay. And, you know, I don't want to be you know, on the side of the conspiracy theorists, but I would be concerned about being paid by Google to investigate Google myself.
Well, to be perfectly honest, I mean, there are some medical studies showing that alcohol consumption is good for you, and they are sponsored by alcohol producers. So I think obviously there's an ethical compromise there, and that is a very serious thing, not so much in cancer research.
Transparency is the key here, isn't it? Because of course, big tobacco for a long time, and now big tobacco finds itself quite heavily mixed up with vaping and these kinds of things. So is that transparency of where funding's coming from? And when there's that transparency, it's much easier to debunk things and to say that, as Anna says, of course, this stuff can't happen without the money. So, you know, but sure, that transparency is there, then theoretically we have no issue.
Excellent point. But I think I would take it a little further. I think it's not only that people believe that some doctors might have been sponsored, compromised by big pharma. I think there's sometimes an assumption of a wide conspiracy. The whole academic world is conspiring to not tell us that some kind of vitamin C will actually cure cancer. And to go that deep, I think it calls for a very deep misunderstanding of how academic world works. Because to me, I'm definitely, give me $100 million to spout misinformation. Maybe I'll break, maybe I'll consider that. However, it would be extremely difficult to persuade everybody who might rat me out, and it would be extremely costly too. So I think, I wonder, how does it come to this, that people believe in a wide conspiracy, even though I do understand if people doubt the moon landing, if people doubt the earth is round, we're already probably past this tipping point. Any thoughts on that, on the depths of insanity?
I mean, one issue here is that the more something's repeated, the more believable it comes. Even if it's unbelievable, if something is said enough times, if we read about it enough times, even if what we're reading about is it being debunked a million times, the fact that it's given that much space and that much time lends it a sense of existence and authority. If so many people are talking about it, then there must be some truth to it, is how the sort of internal mechanism goes as you start thinking about these things. So I could publish a million papers that say that's not true, but then the conspiracy theorists, the vaccine hesitant people, the whoever turns around and says, but why would they publish a million papers about it if there wasn't some truth to it? So the debunking adds to the amount of material that allows you to actually start or continue believing that something's true, which makes the debunking process almost as damaging as the non-debunking process. Now, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be debunking things or that we shouldn't be challenging fake news, but we also have to understand that that process is something more complex than just writing 1,000 articles that say something's wrong. And we have to be really careful here, because what we're really talking about is people who, as I suggested earlier, are seeking to be part of an in crowd, or are looking for an answer for something that is bigger than they are, that they're, want to get some sort of control over. So by just turning around and saying, well, no, you are wrong, alienates them further. It pushes them further to a margin, makes them more marginalized, makes them more desperate to be part of an in-group, makes them more fearful of something they can't control. So I'm not saying we should embrace every conspiracy theorist and say, well, don't worry, we believe you, or we're going to put you on the radio, or we're going to give you airtime, we're going to listen to you. I'm not suggesting we should do that. That's equally dangerous. But we need to understand that just saying, no, you're wrong, actually radicalizes people further towards wanting to be against our position. And so it becomes this really complicated unpicking of people's thinking. Yeah.
That's an excellent point. Actually, there's good psychological research showing the people who are shown facts they disagree with, upon reading research over and over, they come out of the conversation more convinced of their misinformation views. So definitely there's this risk. And also, just as you said, I mean, just providing space sort of moves the perception of where the equilibrium is. If we repeat enough times that vaccinations are problematic, sure, most people will still go for mandatory vaccinations, but some will start to consider, should I actually get this flu shot this year? It's it's a very dangerous, also in the weak level, weak single areas. Anna, what do you think about this from your point of view?
Well, actually, I think the problem is where the perspective starts. At least in general human health, but I think it also applies to politics, economy, and many other fields. That's the problem, what we know from school, starting from the very basic education. My favorite story about COVID pandemic and this, secrets that they are forcing us to wear these masks and all the stuff, is that I have to repeat multiple times to tell you the truth, that people should cover their nose to be protected from the virus, because for many people in our society, it's a surprising information that the nose is actually connected with the lungs. And if we are facing societies with that kind of lack of information, and we don't teach children in school what is vaccination, we teach them how seaweed proliferates and some other very strange biochemical reactions and whatever, but we don't have much, so to say, applicative practical information on what is human life and health, and we don't teach about it, then those people are extremely easy to get manipulated or to believe in things that are completely, out of the blue information. And this, I'm afraid, applies to many fields in medicine, including internal medicine, including knowledge on any, not only infection disease, but people do not know much about diabetes, hypertension. They don't understand the way the pathogens are transmitted. So I think it starts very early in life. If we don't have solid background to understand how the world or human body is actually functioning, then whatever you read fake, you don't even realize it might be fake.
Right. And I want to piggyback on your comment and go a little bit into primary school physics. And one of the things that surprises me tremendously with this pandemic is that people are wearing their masks. Well, they might be covering their nose, but they do not fit the mask at all. And a very basic physics phenomenon tells us that, well, the air will flow where the pressure is lowest. If there is anything prohibiting it, just a very good N99 mask in front of your face when you have a hole here will protect you against nothing for obvious reasons. There is actually solid research confirming that very basic physics phenomenon published last month. And again, this is something people don't even think about. They do not conceptualize how the world works. So we're going into the crisis of education as well. I wouldn't even call it critical thinking. Everybody talks about critical thinking. I think Bruno Latour once said that maybe we overdid it with critical thinking, right? I mean, everybody's questioning everything now. I think it's basics, physics, what bacteria are, what viruses are, how they replicate. And even though we teach advanced topics in high school, we often forget about the simplest ones. And this is my gripe with the Polish education system. I do not know if this is the problem that is more international, though. Doug, what is your take on that?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, and this is a question that I struggle with a lot. I used to be a secondary school teacher. I have taught many students how an oxbow lake is formed in geography lessons, and as I've been teaching it, I've wondered, is this more useful than teaching them how to do their taxes? But there I am still teaching it, you know. So I fully sort of endorse Anna's point. You know, there's perhaps some things that are slightly disconnected from reality in our education system, and there's lots and lots of, we could have another 3-hour conversation about what should or should not be in curriculums, I think. I worry about two things. One is how much we put the onus on the receiver of fake news to be educated enough to be able to discern what is truthful or not. This, when we're talking in a, you know, a sort of hybrid media world where we're, you know, constantly bombarded with information, and large amounts of that sharing of information coming through a press that is designed to make money, and we know that fake news sells, through social media companies who are designed to make money, and we know that the fake news stories sell. So when we are confronting that, putting the full onus on the receiver of the information to be better educated, to be able to discern what's right and wrong, I think is somewhat shifting the blame to those who are the victims of fake news to some extent. Having said that, changing the education system to make people more able to cope and discern with these things, I think is very important. The second concern is that if we start thinking about fake news beyond individual pieces of information that may be false, and we start thinking about it as a tool that is used, as you mentioned earlier, to sort of change and influence politics, then the water becomes much muddier, because now the point of information warfare, if we're going to use that terminology, or, you know, is to fill people's minds with so much information, at times contradictory information, so that it becomes impossible to discern what is and isn't true. And that's the real danger of fake news, is when it gets to the point where even those who are the most, and there's little evidence that people who are highly educated or people who are not highly educated have a different impact with fake news, that it becomes impossible to discern, and we can't actually see through it. But that's the point. You know, Donald Trump tweeting a million things every single day, contradicting himself all the time. That is a masterful piece of fake news. Even if everything he said was true, it doesn't matter, because it's still fake news in terms of that psychological effect that it has. I see Patrick has just shared a really interesting document in the chat from Full Fact, who do some really good work on this kind of thing. And this document is sort of suggesting this idea of, if you tell people that something's not true, that this, how do they refer to it? They call it the backfire effect, this idea that you reinforce people as you challenge them. And it's a very useful document. It's one I've seen before. It doesn't fully address the wider issue of ubiquity of information. It's talking about quite single exchanges. But even organisations like Full Fact have now been compromised. In the UK, our own government pretended to be a fact-checking organisation during a political campaign. So even fact-checking organisations have now been turned into a weapon. So now we can't trust the fact-checking organisations, because who's funding them? Who's behind Full Fact? Who's checking the checkers? But this is the game. This is the fake news paradigm. This is the fake news world. It's not about those individual pieces of information. It's about ensuring that nothing is believable, so that people make their own tribes. It makes it much easier to have that tribal epistemology, to join your political faction, to join your medical faction, whichever, because actually nothing counts anymore. And education's not enough to fix that. It's putting the onus on the wrong person. But at the same time, I'm a great advocate of education. I am an educationalist, and I do think education has a huge role to play. but we need to be careful about who we're blaming, for want of a better word.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. Victim shaming is definitely not something we should be doing. And of course, the link that Patrick shared is a very solid piece of research showing that debunking misinformation might have positive effects too. And it depends, of course, on with whom you talk. If you talk to hardcore believers of a misinformation theory, or if you're talking to people who are hesitant and want to find out more, it's all different. Also, it depends on what kind of misinformation. There are studies of young parents, for example, and their medical beliefs, which are very specific and very different than, you know, let's say flat earthers. But what I'm thinking about is what you've mentioned about the tribal aspects of the whole game, because it appears that a trust is being transferred to strangers, and it's a very interesting phenomenon which I study as well. I'm wondering to what extent the detrimental effect of this tribalism is stemming from the fact that what used to be local communities of people you could trust and you could basically ascribe some authority, some validity because of their history and the fact they are local, they are not going anywhere, is being transferred online now to perfect strangers with authority based only on their avatar. And to what extent it's something worse? Because, and I'm thinking specifically about the new technologies, deep fakes, for instance. I mean, this is an absolute obliteration of truth. Anything you say can be distorted, twisted, and transformed. And from this point of view, I think we were one step behind. It's not about fact-checking anymore. It's not about who says what. We're way beyond that. People don't know, people can trust. And actually what their very eyes, the very primitive, advanced ape eyes, what they can see is oftentimes just distorted. So I'm wondering what both of you think about the brave new world and a bright future that is ahead of us with no known facts for the general public.
I'm happy to come in first. I mean, this Christmas in the UK, Channel 4 national broadcaster, one of our national broadcasters, broadcast a deep fake of the Queen. Now, their thinking behind this, it was on at the same time as the traditional Queen's speech at 3 o'clock on Christmas Day. Their thinking behind this was that if they showed people that deep fakes existed, then people would know that they exist and would be able to be educated enough to be able to discern what's happening. Now, I watched it with absolute horror. I didn't watch it at the time. I have better things to do on Christmas Day than watch the real or a fake Queen. But I watched it with absolute horror because I was thinking, this is absolutely, the effect that you've created is the entire opposite of what you think you've done. All you've done is demonstrate how incredibly easy this is and how a national broadcaster can put this out. And although they, you know, revealed that it was fake at the end, I mean, it was quite obvious it was fake during the middle because it was clearly words the Queen would not say, or you wouldn't expect her to say. But just the very fact that we know that these things exist, exactly like you say, only furthers to muddy the water. I could now sit here and say the two of you aren't real at all. You're both AI. I'm talking to myself. If I didn't like what you said, Anna, I'd just pretend that you were a robot. And now we have the tools for me to legitimately believe that if I wanted to. So again, we have this issue of pushing further away from what is the truth. And so the only thing we hold on to is what supports our identity. And when we're holding on to what supports our identity, we start worrying about what's better for our tribe and our identity than what's true, because the truth doesn't matter, but what makes me feel good does. And we're right in the middle of this right now. And I don't really have any answers for it. I wish I did have, and my students regularly wish I did have in class as well, but I don't have any answers for this. But I think we're right at this precipice where we can now start really looking at this problem and saying, oh, hold on a second, this is bigger than someone sharing a flat earth conspiracy theory. The flat earth bit, like you say, that doesn't matter. No one cares about that. That's not important. But why is that happening, and what does that mean for society? And I think you're absolutely right. This globalized society, I think we could probably trace all of these problems back even further and sort of say the moment we moved towards urbanization, the moment we became city dwellers and put up walls where we can't see the other anymore, that we start sort of wondering what other people are doing all the time. And the less you can see people, the more you invent what's happening. And, you know, we've got thousands of years of this behind us. And then you have things like the surveillance state. We can trace that back to the 1930s, 1940s, when it became clear that, you know, the CIA and other agencies were making it very obvious they were spying on citizens. So this paranoia has been building for a huge long time, that there's no trust. And now it's sort of come to this sort of, well, I hope it's come to the peak and we're not still on the way up, because if we're still on the way up, we're in a lot of trouble. But I'm hoping we're at a peak where we can now start looking over the other side and saying, how do we come back down again? But whether there's the willingness from governments, big tech companies, individuals, to sort of almost collectively say, okay, enough's enough, let's all calm down and start thinking about stuff again, then we're going to find ourselves in further problems, I think. That's not a very optimistic point, is it? I'll try and think of something optimistic to say before we run out of time.
Yeah, you know, optimists believe we live in the best possible world, and the pessimists are afraid this might be true. So, yeah. Yeah, you're right. We were sort of running out of time. So I would like to shift our attention a little bit. And Anna, I would like to ask you this first. What are the practical things we could actually do to stop victim blaming and try to think about the actual solutions, how to help people? What should be done at institutional level, the individual level? Who are the actors that should actually act from your point of view now?
You know, from my perspective, there's much to do by the governments and the general public institutions. One very basic thing that I don't like in the pandemic, let's say in Poland, there is a lot of information, how many people get infected, how many people are intensive care unit. That's a piece of information. But still, if you watch whatever TV, there is no information on what is the virus, how it is transmitted, and that your nose connects with your lungs. People after 1 year of pandemic still don't know that. They don't know the size of the particles, and they don't know what is the size of the pore in the mask, and that it's, you know, it's connected. So starting from very general, information sharing by trusted institutions and governments. Of course, I do my best. I try to explain this to people who ask my opinion in my everyday practice, but I'm quite sure that it should go all around the society. You know, some people won't ever ask me, some never go to see the doctor. And the same applies to many, many other topics, not only medicine. Also, there should be some control over the kind of fake news we have in medicine. There are fake people, so to say, fake doctors. Everybody knows Jerzy Ziemba, I'm sure, I mean, in Poland, right? He claims to be a doctor specialist in every disease. He has no medical formal education. He actually uses title that he does not, deserve. And there are no mechanism law regulations to to block that kind of people. He probably is kind of, let's say, guilty on poor health situation and condition of many people, and he's just really walking on the street, putting his advertisements in Facebook and many other media. So there's much to do by the governments and public institutions, and also general countrywide regulations. if person who sells fake medications can just easily walk the street, everybody in the country knows the name, and there are multiple jokes about him, but still he's free to do that. So that's I think crazy.
And for Dax and everybody else who is not from Poland benefit, Anna is describing a case of quackery and a very successful one, with revenues going into $5-6 million per year. So it is a huge profitable business. Actually, this is the big anti-pharma, not to be something that cannot be basically just diminished and ignored. What do you think, Doug? Is regulation, is the institutional approach the way we should go?
I'm just thinking maybe I should start doing fake news instead of being on this side of the fence. It sounds much more profitable. I mean, and that's the issue, isn't it? The fake news is more profitable. I mean, there's I wasn't going to bring this particular terminology in, but seeing as we've already had some interruptions of much more hardcore nature, I mean, there's this thing called the bullshit asymmetry principle, right? That's been around since the 1700s, called this, and it sort of essentially says the amount of energy to refute bullshit is an awful lot more energy than it is to create the bullshit to begin with. But also the bullshit makes an awful lot more money than refuting bullshit. So maybe I should swap side of the fence and start spreading some lies, and I might be a full professor rather than a doctor. Why not? But yeah, I actually agree with you. I think there's a huge amount of work that needs doing by our political and other institutions. They think they're doing work. They think they are. Macron brought in his fake news legislation. The UK's talked about bringing fake news legislation, but what they're interested in is they're interested in nipping little things in the bud and closing down perhaps that platform, or turning off that bit of news, or putting a little warning here and there. And what that gets met with is, well, you're censoring. That's censorship. So if you're censoring it, there must be something to it. But I agree with Anna that this is deeper. But what we need is institutions who aren't profiteering themselves from the fake news. A lot of our political leaders have got where they are because of fake news. I mean, Barack Obama was for a long time nicknamed the big data president, right? It wasn't necessarily fake news, but using data-driven algorithms to tell people what they wanted to hear. Okay, take it to the next step with Trump, and we're using data-driven algorithms to tell people what they want to hear, whether it's true or not. The UK government is happy to tell people that Christmas will all be happy, everything will be great. Don't forget there's an election coming up. Oh no, actually Christmas was terrible and lots of people have died, but don't worry, we've got through our other agenda. We're happy to announce a royal baby on the same day that we have the highest number of deaths because it covers things up. This is the same kind of, this is a fake news narrative that's happening. So we actually need institutions, and we need governments who aren't able to profit from this muddy water of fake news, and then they'd be interested in actually holding it to account. But at the moment, they want to throw around these little sticking plasters. It makes them look like they're doing something. It often or can exacerbate the situation, but it doesn't really get to the crux of the issue. So I fully agree with you, Anna. There's so much more that these institutions need to be doing, and that these institutions, there needs to be new mechanisms for holding these institutions to account, so that they're not also benefiting from the same thing that they are supposedly trying to regulate or control. Yes, regulation, but regulation of who and by who, and who's going to regulate those regulators, and how does that work? I mean, we have a very complex regulation of media in the UK through Ofcom, and it's never quite managed to get a handle on the internet in the way that it does with television and radio, and it's worked very well on television and radio. I don't think many people would argue that it's got its flaws, but it's actually a pretty good institution. No handle on the internet. So how do we rebuild something like that? Or is the cat out of the bag? I mean, I know Tim Berners-Lee has got some new interesting ideas about reshaping the internet. Time will tell, I think.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. I think we all agree regulation is important, But as you said, I mean, even if you were in the European Union, you
That's a low shot.
sorry, but even if you were, the situation wouldn't be much better, because we have lots of discussions, but we don't really have a single body. We have financial oversight, which is really well developed. Traditional media, not as well developed on the pan-regional level, but it's still so old and so regulated historically that it more or less follows the same tracks. Well, with the new media, it's super obfuscated, they're complex, because the jurisdictions even shift. So it's a huge issue. One thing that struck me, what you said, was basically that democracy doesn't work, because in democracy you have short-term goals. Politicians are obviously oriented on the next elections. So to create a long-term incentive for the rulers to be in the game long enough to see, to reap the benefits, or basically see the disastrous effects they are imposing on us, we would have to reconsider the way the society works. And it's not a small endeavor, because we already know that other systems have other flaws. And I'm looking to China in particular. China is super good at long-term planning, building stuff 30 years, planning 30 years ahead in time. But nevertheless, it's not necessarily the society you would like to live in for other reasons. So I think it's a super complex issue. I know we're running out of time, so I would like to move to a discussion, questions and answers. If there's anybody in the audience who would prefer to ask a question in Polish, I would be more than happy to translate into English. And I think we're probably going to rely on chat, because I think we've had enough porn for today. Whoever wants to go first, just shoot a question in the chat, please. There's a comment from Marta, and she's saying that there is a very strict regulation of the medical professions in Poland, and it is penalized to basically perform medical services without a license, which is true. However, as usual, the devil is in the details. If your business is quackery, oftentimes you will not really position your services as medical advice. You would position it differently. It would be what is the most common thing they are selling? I think this will be dietary supplements, or basically lifestyle advice. And in this particular category, when you say, yeah, please do not treat my advice as medical advice, but I'm going to cure your cancer, it's sort of a little more difficult. And of course, they have the money to go to court. So it is complicated. It's not just the letter of law; it's also the application. And as you said, Marta, implementation of the law is definitely a different story. Other comments or questions? Because we can go on for hours and hours, but we want to give the floor to the audience too.
Well, talking about regulations in medical and paramedical fields, at least in Poland, there is still no formal regulation of psychological advice. So everybody is allowed to give you any advice on your lifestyle or your psychological problems, and they do not need any formal education or registration. So this is one thing that is very much with problems in this field in terms of fake news, because you have enormous number of fake psychotherapists in Poland, at least. So that's a really large field of fake information, at least in Poland.
Yeah, that's a very good comment. And by the way, there is a question: are there any reliable ways of measuring the echo chambers / filter bubbles embeddedness? To what extent people belong to different tribes? I will briefly address this and maybe pass on to Doug and Anna if you want to add. Essentially, social network analysis is often a good start. You will analyze to what extent people are sharing the same thing, liking the same thing, spreading the same information. And then there are different tools even like Tribe Finder. Tribe Finder will try to use machine learning algorithms to detect linguistical patterns and overlaps between specific groups of people. And you will be able, by linguistical patterns, it's even possible to tell whether you're a tree hugger or whether you're a traditionalist, because there will be patterns to that. However, I do not think there's a perfect tool for measuring, to what tribe you actually belong, what filter bubble appeals to you most. Doug, do you know any?
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic, and it's been sort of in the sort of social media research field for a while, and certainly there was a time when everyone was incredibly concerned about this. I've read a few things. I think the Reuters Institute did some research, or someone from the Reuters Institute at Oxford did some research maybe a couple of years ago now that seemed to suggest that these kind of bubbles are not quite as problematic as we may have first thought they were. I think we probably have to discern between those who are fallen in by accident and those who have decided to be part of it on purpose. And I think, that's that idea of this tribal epistemology. Some people are desperately wanting to be in their filter bubble, and they're going to go there, and that's what they want to do, and that's all they want to see, because that's what gives them identity and connects them to, or seemingly, or makes them feel like they're connected to others who are like-minded, regardless of whether that's true or not. The people who are sort of accidentally falling in, I think the evidence is a little less strong than we perhaps thought about 5 or 6 years ago. And there's probably more scope for people to find their way out of those filter bubbles when they actually are interested in finding their way out. It's almost like, giving up smoking, to go back to smoking again for some reason. If you want to give up smoking, it's fine. You can. If you don't want to give up, then you don't stand a chance. So, yeah, I don't have a straight answer for that. I think there's some emerging research around it, and maybe I'm just desperate to think that the filter bubbles and echo chambers aren't quite as prominent as we used to think, because that would make me feel happier about the world. So it might be confirmation bias on my own part here as well. So not much of an answer, but there's certainly lots of interesting things happening.
Anna, any thoughts on that? Yeah, there is a question whether quacks are telling better stories than scholars. I have to take this. I mean, obviously, of course they have better stories. I mean, for proper scholars, there are very strict limitations: biology, physics, chemistry. These are the limits of our knowledge. And when your business is science fiction, the possibilities are endless. So it's much easier to create a plausible story, which is much more pleasant. As Doug mentioned, it's much more pleasant and nice to think that you can find a one fix for all, which unfortunately, as Anna will likely confirm, is not necessarily the case in the medical science.
Well, I have to say that definitely medical science is not so, sexy as fake stories, and not so probably attractive. But I would say there is a hope for science. Just remember the science festivals, like the one that is co-organized by Professor Magda Fikus, when you can actually make fun and enjoy scientific shows, scientific lectures that are presented in a understandable, I would say, way. So there is some chance for scientists and researchers to get in touch with the society, but in everyday practice, I have to put a bit of fault to my medical colleagues. The medical jargon is sometimes very complicated, and I quite think that those people selling paramedical treatments, super extra golden tablets that cure everything, sound much more, you know, heart-touching than I do with my, you know, chemotherapy. So, yeah, there is a difference in the way that we interact with general society, definitely.
There's also a really interesting thing that happens here that I'm seeing a couple of comments appearing in the chat is saying, so why can't scientists tell better stories and things? Well, rarely is the scientist directly, and I'm using scientists in very broad terms here, very rarely is the scientist directly talking to the public. Scientific journals aren't published for the public. So they go through a period of translation. And I was doing some work with some colleagues a couple of years ago about this. We took a whole load of medical journals and Nature and these kind of journals, and we traced the stories through until they appeared in a popular newspaper in the UK. And we looked at how the information was being transformed at every stage. So most of them had been taken from scientific information, then published in a publication like New Scientist or Scientific America, or, you know, more popular science magazines, but still quite highbrow and intellectually rigorous. And then that was taken and put into newspapers like the Daily Mail or the Metro, which is a free newspaper handed out. And, you know, we found stories where the scientists had written up a very good article about implanting something in a mouse's brain so that the mouse would have an additional sense at nighttime. That was all it was, essentially. I'm already paraphrasing, you'd have to read the whole thing. By the time it got to a newspaper, it was published with a picture of Predator from the film and a headline that said, humans may get night vision. Now, why did that happen? Well, at no stage of this transformation was any of the journalists lying or being disingenuous or trying to misrepresent, but so it got changed gradually in each iteration. But by the time it hits that popular media, exactly as Anna was just saying, the thing is you've got to hook it into humans. You've got to make it readable because you've got to sell your newspaper. Who wants to read about a mouse that may be able to slightly sense a little bit more where cheese is while the lights are a bit low? Who cares? Humans get night vision. Amazing story. So we hook in, we buy the newspaper, that's amazing, I'm going to get night vision next year. But no one's made fake news on purpose in that chain, but it becomes transformed as it goes along. We traced about 300 articles to see what was happening, and this was happening time again. And what always happened was moving towards the exciting moment for an individual human. And as much as this might upset Anna, the exciting moment wasn't always just having better health. I didn't just want a cure for cancer. I wanted a cure for cancer that gave me an extra arm as well. You know, it was like it had to have this extra sort of almost sci-fi dimension by the time it reached this popular thing. So it's not necessarily about being able to tell different stories, but I do think there is something, and I see Patrick's asked, what would you change to the educational system? Well, maybe our science lessons should be way more closely linked to our English lessons. Maybe once we've done a science experiment in school, we need to learn how to write that as a story that's interesting and not just as a methodological approach that's good. But, you know, like we can mix this up a little bit and think about how do we present these different subjects. I think I've always been an advocate that we should not have different subjects on different days and in different hours in school. I like the idea of a holistic education where you say, okay, an earthquake has happened. Let's look at the science. Let's look at the geography. Let's look at the history of this area. And then let's write some poetry about how the whole situation might have affected people in different ways. Bring it all together. We start thinking creatively about how we write up science in school. We might solve both of those questions in one go, maybe. I mean, I'm being horribly optimistic here, and no one's given me the power to do any of this. So someone else will need to go and do it.
Well, Doug, I see you're blaming Spider-Man for expecting too much of biology, physics, and whatnot. But yeah, I have to say I agree. My favorite story, personal favorite story of misinformation that was definitely well meant was last year, was it 2 years ago? There was this article which really made the news that chocolate will make you lose weight. And obviously, you know, this is something like, it's the holy grail. Everybody was happy. And
that's my favorite.
Yeah, it made everybody happy. And it's nice, so nice about this story. It's like Doctor Who, makes people happy. But the problem is that of course, when you trace it back, again, the research was genuine, and no, it's nobody's fault. The research showed that if people ate chocolate only for extended periods, indeed they experienced some weight loss. But obviously, mono diets quite often work this way, and in a way, just as you said, well-meant, wanted to spice it up here and there, basically to make the reader happier and more excited about the future. And these things accumulate, and the unreasonable expectations also accumulate. Just as you said, the middle ground is being shifted to the point where, as Anna shared privately with me, sometimes people just don't, they simultaneously, like Schrodinger's cat, they have too low expectations of the medicine and too high expectations of the medicine. They think, it's all big pharma and all doctors are liars, but also they come to the doctor expecting miracles. They think, oh yeah, just give me the pill and it'll be fixed. So this is this dyad of extremely polar perceptions of what actually can be achievable. What do you think, Anna? How does it work from your very practical perspective?
Talking about people expecting miracles, I think fake news and fake, understanding of life starts in the cinema. When I'm watching a medical series, once in a while I do it just for pleasure and having fun. Things that are just put on the screen, I'm afraid they make people think I'm a magician. I do everything, bloodless surgery and express cancer treatment. And the things that people watch on TV every day, it's also a source of misunderstanding of life. I think that people who are visiting hospitals are very often shocked. The way that the medical field actually in real life works, comparing to what they are shown every day, is like, black and white. I'm not a Dr. House, unfortunately.
You're too modest. Right, there's still a question to Doug about the changes to educational system that you would introduce to address the problem. Would you like to take that?
Yeah, I think that we've already touched on that a little bit, hasn't it, about an educational system that brings things together. And I see Marta has pointed out that there are some really good programs in the UK with people like the Royal Society and these kind of things. But why should these be external to our education system? Why aren't these, the core of? And I'm saying, I went to a secondary school, in my teens, that was in one of the poorest towns in the country. The idea of hearing from the Royal Society and getting this extra input was a million miles away. So, we have to think about these things as being deeply embedded in our educational system rather than being additional to. And I think that's always really important when we're thinking about education. It's not what we can tack on, but it's what we can embed within.
Yeah, very good comment. And by the way, Mikołaj Fedorovich is asking why are scientists not professionally trained in storytelling? I would say, first of all, one problem that is unsurmountable is that we cannot make as exciting stories as fantasy and science fiction writers. That's just not what we can do. However, the question is, why aren't we trained in telling the stories? I think that's not necessarily what is being perceived as the scholar's job. We're trained in a very specific genre of writing academic articles, academic books to some extent. And this is super weird genre, by the way. Very ritualistic, very narrow. You have to it takes you years to master writing an academic article. And that's probably why it's also completely inaccessible to regular humans, because it's pretty much like American modern poetry. I mean, if you're not really trained specifically, or wine tasting, if you're not training specifically to be able to discern tastes, you will not be getting it. So from this point of view, if you compare this kind of communication with the communication that is specifically targeting lay people and specifically trying to address the general mass market, I think of course, it would be nice if scholars were trained at public communication, but I would say that this race is already unfair from the beginning. We are not participating in the same game. It's like with marketing. Why aren't scholars as good as marketers? Well, we're not marketers. That's the main reason.
Well, I would revert the question. Why is the society not trained in reading science?
Nikolai Fedorovich would like to, well, I will reluctantly unmute you. Please do not share porn.
Of course, I don't want to do that.
It would be pretty ironic.
I want to make a quick follow-up, because I think that it's not true that scientists can do so exciting stories like Quackers. For example, look at Stephen Hawking. He made a black hole sexy, and not because it was something so interesting for everyone, but because he was so good storyteller. He could play with his disease. He could play with his research. He was not like above the common people, but wants to, you know, show himself into sci-fi shows and so on. So I think this is not true, because we can make science stories sexy, but we need to go to the level of a society and not to try to be above. And by the way, I'm a PhD student and I'm a biochemist, so it's not like I'm, you know, throwing grudges to you, but I'm just making like, you know, it's also on me. This is the first thing, and as the reverse question, why the society is not, yeah, that's me. And as the reverse question, why the society is not trained to reading science? Because we have so much science, so much information that you cannot know anything, everything. It's like too much of it. It's like, for example, I give you one example. Can you tell me what is the third law of dynamics? The Newton's law, third Newton's law of dynamics. Probably not, and not because you're not educated in physics, but because there was so long ago, and probably you were taught in so boring way that you don't remember that. And I think that is the problem, to make scientists or a group of science communicators to go to the public and to tell them and show that scientists are also the humans, not that, you know, weird kind of creatures that are looking from the people from below and say, oh, I have right and you're wrong, and so on, so on. So this is my follow-up. Now you are muted.
First of all, I can disagree a little bit. I think, first of all, there are two things. Remembering what the third law of dynamics is one thing, and understanding what entropy is another. And I would argue that people do not have to know that there is a certain number of laws of dynamics. It doesn't matter. Who cares? What they need to understand is more or less the general law of how systems work, of order, of this entropy, of negantropy. These are the things that need to be, of course, internalized, and they don't have to be memorized. So I think this would be my reply here. Second of all, I think you say that teaching people how to read academic articles is impossible because there's too much academic literature. I don't think this argument stands. I think it is invalid, actually. The ability to read academic papers does not have to give you the power to read all papers. However, being able to understand how an abstract is constructed, or being able to understand how do you communicate the results of academic research is a skill that, in my view, is definitely teachable to the wide public. And I think it's a mistake we're not doing this. I think it would be very valuable, probably much more valuable than many other topics that we teach in school. I will tell you like heresy. I don't care about history. I don't care much about geography that is, sorry, Doug, that is not related to the actual experience of people. If they're going to learn about culture, if they're going to learn about different countries, politics, geopolitics, sure. But if they're going to memorize a long list of features, geology, probably not so much. It's not going to help them in life. However, basic statistics, basic probability understanding will help them in life all the time. The ability to calculate the compound interest is something that will have profound effect in their life when they're getting a mortgage. Being able to understand what is the margin error, understanding what this term means, will allow them to read everyday graphical representations of results. So from this point of view, I think giving them a tool to understand how to read academic articles does not require them to read them all. It only requires them to have this small toolbox repertoire. And here I agree with you that we are not demigods. We do not have any special skill. We've just been trained long enough. And this is something that people should be trained in too. Reading basic scientific communication. Because scientific communication looks the way it is because this is basically practical. It's effective for scholars to communicate this way. Of course, there is a little bit of ritual there, I agree. But some of the communication just relies on the common denominator, the language that is effective in communicating results. From this point of view, it would be reasonable to teach people how laws are written, because this is a very specific language, but also how academic communication is constructed, because it's, again, super useful to tap into. I don't know if you, sorry for this long diatribe. Doug, Anna, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I very much agree. I mean, I think we probably should just address that we were talking very didactically as if all scientists can't write and all other people can write, and obviously that's not true. And I don't think any of us meant to sort of separate people quite so widely. There of course there are people who can really get that science over, who also, you know, deeply embedded in the science. You don't need that mediator in between always. I think one of the things is the massive amount of pressure that's in academia, and I'm sorry to hear that you're a PhD student, you've got all of this to look forward to. I'm joking, of course, it's a wonderful thing to be doing. But there's so many academic pressures. Yeah, so you're teaching, you need to be publishing, you need to be in the top tier journals that have that writing style, to then go on and say, oh, and now you need this extra skill as well. You've now got another job to do. You're an administrator, a teacher, you're a scientist, and now you're a storyteller. It's a step too far for many people to be able to fit within their lives, along with potentially a family and maybe rare in academia, perhaps a social life. But there's, you know, it's another thing that we're asking people to do. I think there's some interesting spaces where we could look at how we better collaborate between, and you know, universities are always talking about cross-faculty collaboration and things, but you know, there is space to work with people who are writers and people who are scientists and who don't feel perhaps confident in writing in that style. And I think it feels like there's been a bit of a shift in the publishing world. You know, people like MIT Press are now really interested in books that are going to go beyond the university library. They want to publish this sort of middle ground between pop science and hard academia. And they're looking for this middle ground. They've got a name for it, and I can't remember what it's called now, but it's this particular demographic of educated middle-class people that they're trying to sell books to outside of academia. And so I think we'll see a little bit of that shift because the market's shifting us as well. But I fully agree. We can teach people to read the basics of an academic journal quite easily. I mean, we all teach our students, you know, those of us that we work in academia, my MA students have got 1 year to learn how to read a 400 academic articles, and they managed to get through it because we tell them how to do it. There's no reason that we can't tell the rest of the world how to do that as well. And you know, I wrote a short article at the beginning of COVID, and I think it was one of the articles that was picked up, which is why I got invited here. And it was, I mean, it was particularly looking at fake news and COVID, but it was called How to Read Like a Scientist. It's been read 500,000 times. So there's a thirst. People are interested. It wasn't just me with a click farm creating fake clicks for, you know, my career. 500,000 people are interested in reading the news like a scientist. So we should tap into that thirst. There's something there. So I think I agree on all of both of your points. I think that was my synopsis.
Any other questions? Darku, odmutuj się.
Sorry, I do not see any questions. I might have missed some, but I'm not sure. It appears we're heading to wrap up. So any final thoughts? Examples of fake news recently, but I can share one, which I think was, well, it was international, but I encountered it in Poland. And I think what is interesting about it is that it takes a vestige of truth, as we discussed, and it basically amplifies it. There was this information about COVID-19 vaccines giving you HIV. And interesting, because, you know, people who are spreading this were linking to an article in English, which was using those words, COVID-19, HIV, vaccination. And the story behind it is that there was this vaccine being developed, not even in a clinical trial yet, in the third phase trial yet. I think it was the first phase, and it was discovered that it can create a false positive. The vaccine was not developed anymore, but it was used as, you know, as this ground for misinformation. And I think it's very interesting to look for instances where just casual brief checking will not work, because we always teach people fact check the misinformation, and many people did. They did fact check it. They didn't speak English good enough to be able to delve into it, but they were making an effort. And especially this kind of misinformation, I think, is super dangerous. And thank you, Patrick Zakrzewski, for linking to demagogue.org.pl. That's super useful website. Any final thoughts, Doug? What do you want to wrap up with?
Yeah, it's really difficult to try and summarize everything that we've talked about, and I think this conversation, and I do hope it can be edited so it's able to put on YouTube, because it would be nice to be able to share it without the interruptions. I think that the breadth of this conversation and the multiple different directions that we've ended up going in just demonstrates how complex this situation is. I think two things are probably to take home from this are, one is empathy, that we really need to think about an empathetic approach to working with people that have been sort of sucked into some kind of fake news narrative, and think about how and why did they get there and what support networks were missing that allowed them to go down that road. And then the second thing that we need to really think about is how that question of how do we hold our political and other institutions to account, so that we actually don't have so many incidences where people can fall down these holes. It's like, you know, the state safety net has been pulled away here somewhere, and I think that's an interesting way of thinking about what the solutions might be.
Awesome. Anna?
Well, I think we're in the middle of the fight, at least in medicine, between fake news and some science going into the society. And I hope that one of the things that pandemia has changed is more access to well, meetings, including the online education, and I would be looking forward for some changes in education trends, because before the pandemic, you could not so easily join any meetings online, and now I don't have to move anywhere from my home to meet extremely interesting people from many fields, you know, just staying at home. So I hope there is something that is good and optimistic, that the access of the society to meetings with scientists, with doctors, with people who are interested in publishing scientific field and making more popular things will be easier. So I hope there is something good that it's going to happen in the next few years.
Yeah, thank you so much. The final question, does some of those fake news emerge from despair? Sure. I mean, obviously, Anna, I think, described quite many of these, especially in medicine. This is, and I totally understand. I mean, if you have a terminal disease, I myself, if I had it, I would try anything. The only problem we're having is that people are dropping the actual cure for quackery. This is the problem. It's not that they are trying stuff, it's that they're trying stuff that doesn't work instead of the stuff that works. Thank you so much for this amazing discussion. I'm really privileged and honored to be able to have this conversation with you. Thank you. For now, I'm passing to our venerable host, and thank you for the debate.
Thank you very much for all of you who listened to this discussion, and for all of those who discussed both via microphone and in chat. And thanks for managing the situation. It was for the first time that we got some Zoom boomed. So yeah, it was quite an interesting moment. So I look forward to actually listening to the discussion on the recording, which of course will be edited and put online. Thanks a lot and have a nice evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.